It's Levi Brackman here with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. Today is the first day of Hanukkah, and I wanted to wish you a joyful and inspirational Hanukkah. Hanukkah is all about lights. It's known as the Festival of Lights. And we light the menorah, and the idea is we take the wick and we put it in oil, and the oil sits in a vessel. It has to have a vessel in order for it to actually stay alight. So this is a metaphor for a lot of Kabbalistic ideas where we talk about the lights in the vessels, the sefirot, the divine attributes, which are really the idea of a divine light in a vessel which actually causes there to be a specific type of color in the light, if you like, which is that specific attribute, whether it's wisdom, understanding, or whether it's the emotions, or which is the kingdom. Either of these things, these are all defined by the fact that there are lights, and the lights are in the vessels and are confined, if you like, by these vessels. So on the Festival of Lights, we're going to talk more about lights and vessels, and particularly we're going to talk about the breaking of the vessels. Last episode, we spoke about how the vessels came into being and what the vessels are. And now we're going to talk about from Olam HaAkudim, which was what we discussed last week, to Olam HaNikudim, so the next world down, and how that emerged from Adam Kadmon, from the primordial man. But before we get into all those details, I want to take a few steps back and give some perspective here. At the beginning, or close to the beginning of the series on Kabbalah, I spoke about how the Zohar and the Ari, the Aitz Chaim, the book of the Tree of Life, written by Levi Brackman, trying to convey the teachings of his teacher, Rabbi Isaac Luria, these were all in response in many ways to the philosophization of Judaism by people like Maimonides and Saadia Gaon and others. So it's really important to be able to see these ideas in how they are responding to philosophical questions and concepts. Now, clearly, we see that the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, and Rabbi Chaim Vital were well aware of philosophical type works, but they never approached any of the discussions with philosophical terms. They couched it in mystical and metaphysical terms instead, in Kabbalistic terms, highly esoteric. But if one understands that what it's trying to do is trying to convey ideas that counter philosophical arguments, then one can decipher that. So I believe that a lot of the concept behind the breaking of the vessels comes in response to the question of evil. And to understand that, first, it is important that we review this question of evil as it relates to the existence of God. So what is the question of evil? Well, it starts off with the idea that if you're going to believe in God, what kind of God would that be? The philosophers, at least, and the Kabbalists would agree that this God is an omnipotent God, all-powerful, omniscient God, all-knowing, and is omnipresent God. He's everywhere. And not only that, this is a God that is perfect from a moral perspective and only does good. So the argument from evil goes as follows. If God exists, then God has to be omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and also all good, morally perfect. And if that's the case, then he's omnipotent, therefore he has the power to eliminate evil. He's omniscient, and therefore he knows when evil is existing. And he is all perfect from a moral perspective, and therefore he wouldn't want there to be evil. So he would want to get rid of evil. But evil exists. We know that evil exists. Children suffer. There's illness. There is murder. There's evil in the world. Go in the animal kingdom and you will find the tremendous suffering which goes up and down the food chain. There is evil in the world. There are things that occur that are unfair. There is injustice that takes place all over the place. So evil incontrovertibly exists. So if evil exists, then you have a problem with a God that is all perfect and all powerful and all knowing. Because how can you have a God that has the power to get rid of evil, and he knows the evil exists, and he knows that that evil is wrong because he's all perfect from a moral perspective? How can those two things exist? How can you have a God and have evil? The result is that if evil exists, therefore God cannot exist. This is an argument that the philosophers make, and there are multiple formulations of it, against the existence of God. If there's evil, there cannot be God. And if there's God, there cannot be evil. And because there's evil, therefore there's no God. That's the argument. Now, one of the ways in which this argument is dealt with from a religious perspective is with something called a theodicy. And a theodicy will explain why evil is here. What's the purpose of evil? And show how that purpose of evil is actually compatible with God. That's what a theodicy is, and there are multiple examples of a theodicy, and we're not going to get into that right now, but I'm sure anyone who's religious, and most of the people who listen to this podcast they've heard theodicies as explanations for why evil exists and how evil is compatible with the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and all morally perfect God. So we're not going to get into theodicies right now. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the Kabbalah seems to deal with this problem in a relatively comprehensive manner. Now, you may or may not be convinced by the arguments of the Kabbalah, but it seems clear to me that with Shevirat HaKeilim, and actually all up and down the system that the Kabbalah and the Ari lays out, it is there to deal very much with this concept, or with this question of the problem of evil. So let's start from the beginning. In light of this, that we've explained that it seems that the Arizal, through his student Levi Brackman, is coming to deal with the problem of evil, let's start from very early on. Because the problem of evil exists partially because why wouldn't God deal with evil? Why would he create a world that has inherently evil in it? If you can explain why God would create a world that is evil, and that there's a higher purpose for that evil, then the problem from evil, in many ways, disappears. Now, you have to be convinced that that's a true reason. But if you have a reason to believe that God would create a world where evil exists, and that's part of his purpose, and there's a much greater thing at play, which can only happen if there is evil, then in many ways you answer the problem of evil. So we go back to the original reason for why did God create the world according to the Aitz Chaim, according to the Arizal. And the answer that is given, and I've mentioned it multiple times in this series, is because God wanted that his greatness should be known by other. And if there's no other, then there's no way that God's greatness can be known. God's greatness, as I mentioned previously, is only in theory. It's only in potential, but not in actuality. And as long as it's only in potential, not in actuality, you have a potential of greatness and not an actual greatness. And given that, God wanted to create a situation where his actual greatness is known. But known by who? Known by himself? Well, for that, you don't need to create a world. He wanted to be known by other. So he had to create a world where there was at least the illusion of other. Now, we also discussed whether this idea of tzimtzum. So now, those who've actually gone through with us and listened to all the episodes, and if you haven't, go back to listen to previous episodes where we talk about the reason for creation, and we talk about tzimtzum, and when we discuss whether tzimtzum, whether the contraction of light actually happened, or whether it was only an illusion that it happened, whether there was a real contraction of light, whether we said it was tzimtzum kipshuto, an actual contraction of light, or whether it was lo kipshuto, it was just an illusion of a contraction of light. If you remember, we discussed that in detail, and if you don't, go back and listen to that episode. So if there is an actual contraction of light where God removed his light from that circle, and now there was an empty space with no light, there is an actual other there. And if that is actually what happened, and there was another, there was room for other, God didn't create the other. The other just happened by default. Well, that's a good philosophical argument. Does that mean he created it? But by removing his light, there's now room for other. And that other is now there. Even if it's an illusion, there's still an illusion of other. So even if our pain is all an illusion, and the evil in this world is all an illusion, that illusion still feels real to those who are experiencing the evil. So even if you call it an illusion or not, the reality is, the other feels like it's other. So that was by design. God wanted there to be another. They wanted that the otherness of God, if you like, should feel other in order that the other, that which isn't God, should recognize God's greatness. Without that, there would be no purpose. So there has to be other. In this whole formulation of the creation of the world, without there being this concept of other, the purpose of creation wouldn't be fulfilled. But if you just have other, and the other doesn't recognize God, then the purpose of creation is also not fulfilled. So the idea is that you need other, which from its own volition in some way recognizes God. Because if it happens without its own volition, if it happens because God influenced us to recognize God, then it's not really other recognizing God. And therefore the whole purpose of creation doesn't come into being. God created the world so there should be other which doesn't recognize God, and then recognizes God's greatness from its own volition, not because God told it to. And that is the whole purpose of it. And for that to happen, there has to be other, which feels like other, and has the ability to, on its own, recognize God's greatness. And now we have the fulfillment of the purpose for which God started the whole enterprise of the universe so that his greatness should be recognized not just in theory, not just in potential, but in actuality by something that is other. So to reiterate this idea of the other, there has to be a sense of detachment from the divine. That in the world, God isn't felt in a overt fashion. That has to occur. In order for that to occur, as we mentioned, there has to be this idea of a contraction of the divine light and at least a sense that God is not there. Whether that's in actuality or whether it's just an illusion, at least from the perspective of the other, of creations, it doesn't matter. It feels like God is not there. It feels like it's devoid of God. Now, when you read the Aitz Chaim, when you read the book of the Tree of Life, he talks about the idea of a contraction, a tzimtzum, that takes place within Adam Kadmon, within the primordial man. So there is the tzimtzum harishon, which was the first contraction that took place. There where God withdrew all of his light, if you like, and created this circle that allowed for the reintroduction or the reintroducing of divine light into that circle. The problem, however, is you still have divine light, and that divine light is still there creating things. So all those creations, Adam Kadmon, for example, feels the divine. It still feels very connected to the divine. How do you get to a place where you have the world, the physical world, which doesn't feel the divine at all? So you need another series of contractions. And in Adam Kadmon itself, there is a contraction. And he says it's like the contraction that took place in the first place, the first contraction. It's similar in nature. The light, if you like, Adam Kadmon has two parts. Has the top part, which are the intellectual part. And then you have the emotions. And the contraction took place from the intellect to the emotions. And what happened was that the light from below went up, and the light below was removed. There's no light below, there's only light above. And the three intellects. So that is the idea of the contraction in Adam Kadmon itself. And then you had the new light, which came in place in the light below, similar to the idea of the kav, similar to the idea of the line, which came in after the first contraction, which was the tzimtzum harishon, which was reintroduced to the vacuum after the first contraction. So you have a new light introduced also in Adam Kadmon after the tzimtzum took place within Adam Kadmon. So there's a whole series of these contractions that take place, and each time you have a lessening of the light, until you eventually end up with a situation where you have the physical world. But there's a problem with that. As you have a degrading of the light, level after level after level after level, you don't end up with a situation where there's no light at all. It's still a divine light. And as it's still being a divine light, how do you end up with a situation where it's devoid of God? How do you end up with total devoidness of God? Even with all these contractions, yes, the lights get lower and lower, and the grade of the lights get less, the intensity of the divine, but it's still the divine light. So that's where you have this concept of Shevirat HaKeilim, which is really interesting. What is Shevirat HaKeilim? The breaking of the vessels. So the breaking of the vessels, it's such a fundamental concept in Lurianic Kabbalah, because I think it's there to explain why we have evil, and then allow for a situation where you have people who don't feel the divine at all and people who do feel the divine. And then you have the concept of evil as being this idea of us as humans being able to transcend that and to reconnect with the divine and fix that which was broken and allow for the purpose of creation to come to fruition. So what is Shevirat HaKeilim, the breaking of the vessels, and how did it happen? Well, there are a few explanations for it, and I'm going to try and explain it in the simplest possible way, because if you read the Arizal, if you read the Aitz Chaim, there are pages and pages and pages of descriptions of it, and it's all very complicated and intricate details. I'm going to try and simplify this as much as possible. So if you think about in Adam Kadmon, we described that this was in the form of a person. Obviously, the Kabbalah doesn't think there was any physical being there, but in order for humans to understand what he's talking about, he describes it in the way of something that is human, in a human form, and God created man in his image. So there is an idea, at least, of some kind of divine image of human form. And the divine light, which came out of Adam Kadmon, came out in multiple different ways. As I mentioned, some came out of its ears, some came out of its mouth, of its nose. And there was light which came out of its eyes. And that light which came out of the eyes of Adam Kadmon the primordial man, this form in the divine, in the Godhead, is called Nikudim, which means dots or points. So the world of dots or points. And the reasons why it's called that, we won't get into that in detail here. But what's important to understand here is that as the light came out of its eyes, it then had to go through the other lights, which came out of the nose and of the mouth, and those are lower lights, if you like. And as it interacted with those lights, it got vessels created around it. Now, it's important to understand, according to the Kabbalah, that vessels are also a type of light. They're just a more coarse type light, and they are a aspect in the light that adds certain limitations to the light. So that light then has these limitations, and it's not just light, which is just floating. As I mentioned in the beginning, that if you want to have light, if you want to light the menorah, there needs to be a vessel for the light. So the idea here is that somehow it limits where that light is, that it's here and not there. It's this type of attribute and not that type of attribute. And those occurred as the lights which came out of the eyes of Adam Kadmon, they went down through also and interacted with the light of the nose and with the mouth, etc. And therefore the vessels were created. So now you have lights and vessels in the world of Nikudim. But at some point, the vessels of some of those lights were not able to contain the lights. There's actually, according to this formulation, the three intellects, Keter, Chochmah, and Binah, they actually were able to maintain the light in the vessels. It was the lower seven sefirot, the lower several attributes or lights, that the vessels were not able to be contained in them. The results were that the vessels broke and they fell down into the lower worlds. Some of the words which are used are that they actually died. There was a death that occurred. Whenever the light goes away from the vessel, all that is left is the vessel, and therefore what happens is that's a death. And the example is used of a person who dies. A person who dies, according to the Kabbalah, the soul leaves the body, and when the soul leaves the body, you end up with just the body and not the soul. And that is what death is. The body is still there. This body is like the husk. It's the vessel for the personality of the person, for the soul. And what's left is just the body, not the soul, and the person's dead. So this is the idea that happened with these vessels. So the vessels, the light was too great, and therefore it smashed the vessels, and the vessels then fell down, they were dead. Within that, though, there's still some light. And it gives an example that even when a person dies, if there was nothing to sustain the body at all, if there was no spiritual energy, if you like, there's no life force in the body at all, the body would cease to be. And then he goes in to explain that if you are not righteous, then actually when you die, there's nothing which maintains you, and therefore there's no ability to get up in the afterlife. There's no resurrection of the dead for those people, only for people who have some life force in them. So they die, but they don't totally die, so to speak. There's still some residue of the divine life force in the person even after they died. That's a Kabbalistic idea. But the same idea is presented for the idea of Shevirat HaKeilim, the breaking of the vessels, that whilst the vessels break, and therefore the light's not there, and they fall down, and that's a type of death for the vessels, but it's not a total death, because there's still some light there which still maintains it. But the idea here is that the vessels break, and they fall down into a lower world, the world of Bria, the world of, and there's another bunch of worlds, Bria, until you get to this physical world, and they fall down all the way down. And there ends up being Reish Peichet, which is 288 sparks that fall down into the lower worlds. And let's leave that for a second. Let's continue talking about what caused the Shvira, what caused the breaking of the vessels. So according to this, the breaking of the vessels were caused in the following way. There's a number of reasons for it. One reason was because there was chaos. It's actually called the world of chaos. And when there's chaos, nothing's in order. Everything is mixed with each other, and everything is therefore in full intensity. You don't have the ability for there to be any kind of order, and the vessels can't bring order to it. So when you have a situation where everything is in its full intensity, you have Gvura, for example, which is the idea of strength. It's full strength, total and utter strength. And then you have Chesed, kindness, which is in its total and utter strength of Chesed, of kindness. And then you have Tiferet, which is beauty, totally uncompromised beauty, etc. When you have that, and then they are all competing with each other, and they don't take each other into consideration, you end up with an inability to contain any of them. So that's what happens. It ends up breaking, and the vessels just can't contain them, and the vessels fall down, and the lights just remain there. There's one of the explanations for it given by the Arizal through his student Rabbi Chaim Vital, that if you think about the way in which the 10 sefirot are formulated on paper, very often you'll see it in 3 lines, and we've discussed it in this podcast. You have 3 lines, one right, one left, and one in the middle. And you have Keter on top, and then you have Chochmah, you have Binah, you have Gevura, and you have Chesed. In the middle you have Tiferet, Netzach, and Hod, and then you have the middle Yesod, and then Malchut. Each one, there's lines which connect one to the other. And through those lines, you have the ability for them to actually interact with each other. And therefore, they balance each other out. So you have balance. Whereas, in the world of Akudim, in the Tohu, in the world of chaos, you ended up that only the first 3, those were the ones which were interacting with each other. All the rest, one came after the other, and each one was in its own intensity, its own individuality, and therefore there was an inability for any kind of vessels to contain them, and the vessels broke. That's one explanation. Another explanation, which is given, which is related to that explanation, is that there was chaos. They were all like one light together. So they were all like with its own intensity, but all together and mixed together as one. There wasn't any kind of order there. And because there wasn't any order there, everyone was doing its own thing. Therefore, you ended up in a situation where nothing could contain it. It's like herding cats, and the whole system breaks and ends up being total chaos. There is an idea here which is brought out, which is that whenever you have this kind of chaos, either there's too much individuality, where each thing is its own thing and very uncompromising in its own way, then you end up with a situation where there's chaos and you have anything truly built. Everything ends up being destroyed. Or if you have a situation where things are not properly countering each other out, you don't have counterbalances. It's one thing. Only chesed, only kindness. Or you have only gvura, only severity. And you don't have severity, which is sometimes tempered by kindness, which is sometimes tempered by severity, the system breaks down. And there are many examples of this, which we can go into it. We could do a whole episode just on the lessons which we can learn from this. But if you take it to your own life, take it to the political factions that exist in the world, take it to your business, you will understand the lesson of the importance of having a balance, and also the importance of having some kind of order where there's a time for kindness and there's a time for severity, and there's has to be an ability to be able to synthesize these two things, so you end up with tiferet, with beauty, and that beauty is not a thing on its own, but is also mixed with kindness and severity, etc. That didn't exist in the world of dots or points, in the world of chaos, and therefore you ended up with Keilim, the breaking of the vessels. And those vessels then fell down into the lower worlds, but you end up with these 288 sparks which are in the lower worlds, which the idea is that there needs to be a repair afterwards to fix these broken vessels, to bring order back to the chaos. And before we get into what that order to the chaos is, it's important to understand that these Keilim, these vessels, the husks which fell down, they represent very often this idea of the klipa, meaning the peel. So you end up with a husk of a vessel which falls down. It's not a vessel which is with its intensity of light. Because if you have that, then the vessel is only trying to contain the godly light. It's not a thing on its own. It comes with godliness. And therefore it doesn't seem like it's totally other. If you just have the vessel on its own, falling down, then that really is a kind of other, because that is the limitations within the divine, which is limitations without the divine in itself. Although it's divine limitations, it's in the limitations of the divine. It really seems like it's limiting. It's only the limitations. If you think about a God which has the ability to limit, and the ability to be unlimited, and the ability to limit is what then brings down the gradations of light one after the other. It starts off with that big tzimtzum, the big contraction. That is the force of limitation within the divine. But as long as that is together with the divine energy, then you have limitations of the divine energy, but it's still the divine energy. But when the limitations itself is there without the divine energy, or with only a little bit of the divine energy, which is just like there to keep the limitations being limitations, so they don't die entirely. And that was the idea, that if there wasn't a little bit of the divine there, it would totally die, it would cease to be. So you need the limitations to be there with the divine energy, but that divine energy is only there to maintain the limitations. So it's not there to show divine energy. It's just to maintain the limitations. So all you have is pure limit. And that pure limit seems to be other than God. One is unable to see God in the limitations. I have a cup here, for example. And this cup, it has limitations. It's It's just a cup. I'm unable to see God in this cup because all it is limitations. It doesn't seem like it's God at all. Actually, it just feels like a cup. So when you have the power of limitation within the divine, and it's only its power of limitation, it doesn't seem like it's God at all. It seems like total other than God. And in that is what's able to create this concept of other. And when you don't have God there at all, that's when you can end up with this situation of evil. According to the Kabbalah, what is the idea of evil? Evil is the idea of there not being God. If you have connection with God, then it's not evil. How do you fix evil? By reconnecting with God. When I bring the light back into here, according to the Kabbalah, then I now have dvekut again. Dvekut means cleaving. I've now cleaved with God again. I've reconnected with God. And now it's no longer seems like it's limited. Now it's divine. When I reconnect with God, that's when I bring the divine in, and that's when evil disappears. But there needs to be evil. There needs to be this total disconnect, if you like, from God. Just the limitations of God in order for the reason or the purpose of the world to come into fruition, which is that the other should be able to see God and recognize God. So this is all consistent with the divine. One of the counter arguments to the problem of evil could be God could have created the world which wouldn't have had evil in it altogether. The Kabbalah's response to that would be, but God wanted to create the world in that way because that is what he desired as the purpose for it, so that he could be able to show his greatness not just in potential, but in actuality. And for that, you need other. And for that, evil is required. Now, you might ask a question, why did God want that in the first place? And for that, the answer is given as, you can't ask a question on a desire. We don't know why we want things. Why do we want things? Why do we desire things? And it's interesting the way the Kabbalah puts this and couches this in the explanation of male desiring female. Because why does a male want a female? Why is that attraction that a male desires female company? Why does a man actually want to have sexual intercourse with a woman? What's the reason for it? Is there any logical reason that can explain it? It's not logical. It's a taiva, it's called. It's a desire. And you can't explain a desire. It's not logical. You're never going to be able to explain it in a logical way. It's just a desire which is there. It's natural. It's innate. And it uses that analogy to explain the creation of the universe. Why did God want this? And we explained in previous episodes this idea of even when there wasn't femininity there, God still desired femininity. And the idea is that a man, even without a woman, would desire a woman, even if there was no woman in existence. And we see that in the story of creation. Adam, the first man, God created him according to that story. And in that story of creation, Adam looked around and he also wanted a helpmate. He also wanted female. So God created female for him. So the idea here is that female is desired by male, even if female doesn't exist. Why? There's not a reason which can explain that. It's a taiva, it's a desire. And as they say, you can't ask a question on a desire. It's not a logical thing. So here we get the entire picture. God desired the universe. Why? Because he wanted there to be other, so that his greatness should go from potential to actuality. Why did he want that? There's not a logical reason for it. But in order for that to happen, there has to be other. And in order for that to be other, there has to be this creation of the world in this way, where you have all these contractions, but you also have Kelim, the idea of the breaking of the vessels, which is the idea of the chaos, and then those vessels fall down, and that is what creates this pure limitation. And this pure limitation is what we have as aspects which are totally devoid of God. So it seems like God isn't there at all. And then what we need to do as humans is tikkun, is to fix that, is to actually see the divine in these places from our own volition, with our own free will, not because God showed it to us. And that, yes, leaves room for evil according to this conception. Now, there are lots of philosophical questions one can ask about this whole idea. Would a God, which is truly good, want this? And would he create a universe which had inherent in it suffering and evil? Would he want something which could only be accomplished through this tremendous amount of suffering and evil? Would a good God, a God which is truly morally good, want such a thing? And that's a really good question. That's a philosophical question. But the Kabbalah, he's here to talk about esoteric teachings, but is aware of the philosophical questions, and through the esoteric teachings addresses these philosophical questions of why we have evil. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the bottom line and there's no more questions related to the question of evil, even in the philosophical conception of it. But this is definitely theodicy, in my view. This is explaining this cosmic work at play. And a desire of God, which is the highest possible desire, which can only be accomplished through evil, and there's something about that desire which is so important that according to this conception and this formulation, evil is worth it in order to be able to get there. And that's the way certainly I think the Kabbalah looks at it, and it's how it addresses the question of evil. Whether philosophically it's satisfactory or not, that's an entirely different question. So this has been the episode about Kelim, breaking of vessels. We touched upon the idea of tikkun, of how that's fixed. Next week, we're going to finish up our series on Lurianic Kabbalah with talking about tikkun and reviewing the entire series, and that will complete our series on the Kabbalah. And then we're going to move on to another series where we're going to be talking about Jewish values, and we're going to have some commentary on the culture. And one of the reasons I'm going to be talking about that is because as I look around the world, I see that there is a tremendous need for some clarity in some of the moral, ethical values that exist. I think that we are in need of a voice which is able to explain in a way in which is in line with some of the Jewish values that exist from a moral, ethical perspective. And I hope that this will be a little bit of my contribution to creating a better world for ourselves, our children, and future generations. And so that is what I'm going to be talking about in my next season of the Truths Jewish Wisdom for Today podcast. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, like it wherever you listen to it. That allows other people to see it. But that leaves me to just wish you a very happy Hanukkah. Thanks for joining, and until next time.